And now, Dan and John, welcome to our program.
Hey. Kim, thanks very much. And thanks to all of you for joining us here today. As all of you know, as most of you know, over the past several months, I've had the great privilege, thanks to Kim and her colleagues at the LA World Affairs Council Town Hall, of hosting a series of breakfast conversations, the Cal Eisenberg Breakfast Series. And it seems odd that just 4 weeks ago, we did one of these programs right after Super Tuesday, California's presidential primary and the primaries in over a dozen other states around the country. And it's really remarkable, of course, how much not just the political world has changed, but how much our entire world has changed in 4 short weeks. And what I noticed as I was preparing for today's discussion, looking back over the program we did 1 month ago, for those of you who attended in person, back when we were able to do such things, you may remember that over the course of an hour in which we talked about the upcoming primaries in Ohio and Florida and Arizona, in which we talked about who Joe Biden should pick as his running mate, in which we talked about what Bernie Sanders' timeline was, we were about 45 minutes into, actually we're over an hour into a 90-minute program before the topic of coronavirus even came up. And of course, in less than a month, it has fundamentally remade our world and remade our political world as well. And so even though we've been smart enough and lucky enough to schedule my friend John Thomas to appear with us in April, long before the pandemic fully hit this country, it's particularly appropriate and particularly timely that we have John with us today, because just as the pandemic has upended every aspect of life here in this country and around the world, it's dramatically changed politics as well. And perhaps the most significant change that we've had in the political landscape is that politics has now moved almost exclusively from an in-person endeavor, speeches and rallies and so forth, to an online discussion. And so we'd be really lucky under any circumstances to have John Thomas with us here today, but particularly given this very unfamiliar new political landscape that we're navigating, having someone with us with John's expertise in digital and social media is particularly beneficial. John, thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. That was a very nice intro, Dan. Thank you.
Excellent. And by the way, I'll let all of you know our guest was one of the nation's premier Democratic political strategists who'd been the national political director for the Hillary Clinton for president campaign in 2016. Because we're all about bipartisanship and multipartisanship here, while there are acclaimed digital experts on both sides of the aisle, we bring John with us today from the Republican side of the aisle, not any more than Amanda did, to advocate for a candidate or a party or a cause, but talk about how smart digital strategists like him are navigating this new landscape in both parties. And so what we'll do, as we do when we gather in person at Akasha, is I'll take a little bit of time to ask John some kickoff questions to frame the discussion. And then, as Kim mentioned, what we hope that you'll do is send questions to Jessica, and she'll forward them to us. And once we move from the conversation that John and I are having together, you should feel free to send questions to John or to me or to both of us. And between the two of us, we'll do the best we can to give you good answers and good guidance. So John, let's get started with the conversation. Politics is all digital now, and it's impacted different campaigns and different candidates in different ways. Bernie Sanders and President Trump used to rely on huge in-person rallies to communicate with their supporters and motivate their respective bases. Joe Biden's greatest political skill, as many have noted, is the person-to-person, hand-to-hand, face-to-face campaigning. Well, all candidates in both parties have been deprived of those skills on which they've depended for so many years. Tell us a little bit, as an advisor to candidates all across the country, what you're telling your candidates about how to communicate down the line. First,
First of all, I apologize for the any wind noise or anything. So if my audio is terrible, I can rework it. But Dan, can you hear me okay?
well, just fine. Keep going.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Great. Great. So really, the way we're campaigning has absolutely changed. I mean, to Dan's point, we went from this politics being mostly a retail sport to the power of social media really transforming how we're trying to think about how to reach candidates. And it's really not just affected voters. It's also affected how we raise money, right? We did raise money online a lot of the times, but now people are not quite as loose with their pocketbook because of the economic uncertainty. And the larger donors that finance campaigns as well, Dan, as you know, want to go to rubber chicken dinners. You want to touch the product, meet the candidate, hear their speech, and none of that's happening anymore. So it's really caused us to reevaluate how we're doing everything. So what we're telling candidates right now, first of all, if you look at the presidential level, is completely different right now than a congressional candidate because the presidential level, if you're President Trump, you can still do the broad addresses, you can still command the mainstream media. If you're a congressional candidate, I mean, who really cares about what you have to say in the nightly news? They just simply don't. So what we're doing is we're trying to keep engaged the existing supporters we have through teletown halls on people's cell phones, audio-wise, engage them in these kinds of chats. But it's also, Dan, I would say the challenge it's not just in challenge in terms of reaching potential voters, but the question is, what do you say to them? Because normally, and Dan, you know this better than anybody, at this point in a campaign, we would do something called a benchmark survey and kind of lock in our message with little minor tweaks all the way till November. That's completely out the window. So we're doing more research and polling than we've ever done because, yes, we're talking about COVID-19 right now. Maybe we're still talking about that in November if it comes back, but really understanding what the concern is as it relates to the COVID crisis for the particular office that candidate is running for can change week to week. So we're no longer just locking in a message and repeating it everywhere we go. We're trying to monitor public opinion, stay a step ahead, and use technology to engage with these people in a time where, do you really care what a candidate for Congress has to say? It's just a challenging time all around.
Well, let's do this. Let's come back to candidates at the congressional level and for other races, because you're exactly right. The ability for them to get heard when people are concerned, understandably, about their livelihoods, about their lives, and the safety and the health of themselves and their loved ones is obviously going to be a lot tougher. Let's start out, though, at the presidential level, and let's work our way through the ladder. I'll offer you a thought, and you tell me if it makes any sense to you or not. If it doesn't, correct me, and then if it does, then we can just remind each other how smart we are. But watching the Democratic field to begin with, Joe Biden, of course, pretty much had this nomination locked up the day after Super Tuesday. Has a prohibitive lead in the polls, and there is, according to most estimations, roughly a 1% chance, at least under normal circumstances, that Sanders would be able to catch up. And again, I underscore the phrase under more normal circumstances. But essentially, the primary is frozen in place. With the exception of the state of Wisconsin, which is holding their primary next Tuesday, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, all of the March and April primaries have been moved to June. Sanders is staying in the race. He's made it clear that he wants to debate Biden next month. How much of a challenge is this new landscape presenting for the presumptive Democratic nominee, Joe Biden?
Oh, it's incredibly challenging. And let's just talk. First, you have the primary, of course. Some people don't even know that Joe Biden is still running for president because where is he? Dan, he's camped out in a bunker, giving a daily web address. The question is, who's tuning in? Do they care? And to be frank, he's one of the most at-risk populations to this. So normally a campaign is all about projecting strength and confidence and not hiding and retreating. you literally have both Democratic candidates right now that truthfully should never leave the confines of their bunker because of the risks that this virus causes to them. That's not where you want to be in projecting the strength and confidence that you can lead a nation, is when you're ducking and covering, whether or not that's what your doctors tell you to do. At the same time, Dan, a lot of people are looking at this Democratic presidential race saying, wait a second, yes, Biden was a presumptive nominee, but because he's not a sitting office holder, he can't do anything during this crisis. He's had to duck and take cover, rightfully so, and he's irrelevant versus Governor Cuomo, who says he's not running for president, but really in his daily addresses in New York has captivated a nation's attention because they're at the epicenter. So if I were Joe Biden right now, I would be figuring out, how do I ensure that I can maintain my lead and not get beat up at a virtual convention where this nomination might go to the person who's actually made a difference in this crisis? And if you're Bernie Sanders, you're just waiting around to see what happens, because I don't know how you make yourself relevant in this process either.
Although I would say this, that Sanders, despite the prohibitive delegate count that he's facing, it seems to me Sanders has two advantages over Biden in this regard. One you referenced earlier just in passing is Joe Biden, while he has a tremendous amount of experience, in my own opinion, is that in the last Democratic primary debate a few weeks ago, there was a marked contrast between Biden's ability to talk about the virus and how to respond to it, as opposed to Sanders. Biden, as you pointed out, is not an office holder now. And people who are thinking about their lives and their safety and their health, they are turning to their governors, whether it's Andrew Cuomo in New York and Gavin Newsom in California, whether it's Republicans Mike DeWine and in the state of Ohio. Governors, mayors are taking the forefront here. So one, Biden, despite his experience, is not an office holder. So there's not a logical role for him in this emergency discussion. The second challenge, and I'd like to hear you talk about this as a digital professional, is the Sanders campaign, not just through 2019 and 2020, but going all the way back to his campaign against Secretary Clinton in 2016, put a huge amount of time and effort into establishing a range of digital platforms for Sanders. Both he and his campaign are very proficient and very comfortable communicating digitally. And that's a newer a challenge for the vice president in his campaign. And they're still struggling a little bit, aren't they?
Well, it is. And you hit it on the head, Dan. And just to put a finer point on this, remember, until South Carolina, Joe Biden's campaign was all but dead. He had no money. He had no bodies on the ground. And he had no real dominant online infrastructure, something that Senator Sanders has building up, to your point, for years and years and years. One thing that this boost of momentum since South Carolina has allowed Biden to enjoy is to get mainstream media coverage that then feeds your online donor and activist acquisition program to build up a digital army that's worthy of being the Democratic nominee for president. But because of this crisis and how this has all shifted, it's slowed down Joe Biden's ability to match what Bernie Sanders was doing. So to your point, Bernie Sanders is much better equipped, both because he's relevant as an elected, but also because he only raised money online. He never did rubber chicken dinners for donors. He had a frothing Bernie bro activists that engaged digitally and have been for some time. So he's better suited for this time. Bernie's problem is just electoral math. But certainly his ability to turn out his voters. And here's the other thing, Dan, what we're not talking about is the population that is Biden's core constituency are older, whiter voters, or now I guess now it's changed in South Carolina. It's more of a blend, but Bernie does better with younger voters. Biden does better with older voters. And older voters are the ones that are staying home and are most concerned about the risks of going out. So how does that shift the turnout model for these upcoming states? And does that shift the delegate math?
And of course, that leads us to a conversation that we'll get to in just a minute about the logistics, not just of campaigning, but of voting. in a coronavirus era. But let's shift sides for a minute, and I think it's worth noting before we do that, as I said, 4 weeks ago, we were not talking about virtual campaigning as the centerpiece of the 2020 election at all. Now it's become predominant. We don't know if 4 weeks from today, 8 weeks from today, whether Vice President Biden will have found a way into the conversation as the election draws closer. So it's worth reminding everybody that this is a snapshot in time, and that Biden and the people around him will be looking for ways to make him more central to the conversation. But I think what John has pointed out is very smart, is the challenges that will exist as they figure out how to do that. But John, let's switch over to the Republican side, to the president's reelection campaign. And I'll ask you to address this not as a Republican consultant, but as a really smart digital expert, and a really smart political expert more broadly. Couple of things I've noticed, and I think a lot of us have, is the president's poll numbers over the last few weeks have gone up to some degree. And what I saw in the Washington Post ABC poll last week, for example, is that while he's still running behind Biden in head-to-head matchups, he's closed that gap. And the reason it seems to me he's closed that gap, if you look at the numbers a little bit more closely, is that voters are giving him a more favorable response as it specifically relates to his handling of the coronavirus. In the March Post ABC poll, 17% of Democrats said that they approved of the job that Trump was doing. A month earlier, 4% had. Now, we don't know if those numbers are going to sustain or not, but it does appear that the president is benefiting to at least a small degree from what they call the rally around the flag effect that American presidents benefit from during a time of war or other crisis. Is that sustainable?
This is a high stakes game that the president is being forced, whether he likes it or not, politically to play. I think your analysis is right. The president is enjoying a broadly well-received response to his handling. I think his daily briefings have been transparent. One reason it's too early to say yet whether or not the president gets reelected. I mean, there's just so many things can happen, and the president will probably live or die based his, at least political reelect, will live or die on how we end up in this COVID crisis. I mean, where we end up. So the polling numbers right now it's reflective, not predictive, reflective of where we are now, not predictive of where we'll be. But I actually think, Dan, this crisis has not only allowed Trump to dominate the news coverage as the commander in chief, but it's really addressed what some would say is his central critique, which is that he's petty and he can't get along with others. And you're finding throughout this crisis that he has reached across the partisan divide to get things done. Now, I'm sure there are people watching that can bicker and say, we didn't do enough here. But just back up for a second, and look at where we're at. Governor Newsom of California is broadly praising the president for being responsive and doing anything he can to help out California. You're seeing this now. Maybe that's because Governor Newsom will do whatever he needs to do to get the aid for his people, be it whatever the political motivations are. President Trump is getting past that fundamental flaw, which is he doesn't play well with others. And so that, if he can continue to address that or receive praise on that, is something that only in this crisis, I think you could have seen that come out in the president.
Well, I think, I agree with you, John, that is a central challenge for the president. And I think what I'd say is that, at least right now, the progress he's making that you discuss is somewhat of a mixed bag. Governor Newsom has been very cautious in the way he's discussed his relationships with the White House and with the president. Other Democratic governors, Governor Inslee of Washington State, Governor Whitmer of Michigan, have had a much greater challenge with him. And I think your broader point is right, which is if he is able to surpass or to get past a tendency over the last few years to partisanize these kinds of discussions, that probably does enhance his chances. But I would say that it's still a work in progress. Let me ask you this though. And it's not disagreeing, but just raising the logical point that comes up from hearing your analysis. The governor's favorable rating, the president's favorable ratings are up to some degree. By the same token, the favorability ratings of most governors in the country, Democrat and Republican, are up by a much greater degree. The president is now viewed marginally favorable, 45 to 43%, 46 to 44%, when people are asked about how he is handling the virus. When they're asked about their governor, those numbers tend to be in the 70s and 80s. When voters in other countries, in France and Great Britain and other Western democracies, are asked about their leaders, their rally around the flag effect is a much greater one. And if you look historically, it's George W. Bush after 9/11, at Jimmy Carter after the hostage crisis, at Franklin Roosevelt in World War II. The increase in support for the president seems to be much higher. It seems to have been much higher in the past than it is currently. Is that because Trump has approached his office in such a partisan way and on so many fronts in the past, or are there other explanations for that?
Well, it's a very fair point, and you can look at the rolling Gallup track that's been watching the president's approval since he took office, Dan, and there really hasn't been much movement. And so it really speaks to the fact, I think, more than people's opinions are pretty well baked. And so about this president, more than any president ever before. And so to see movement on approvals, you're going to see it a lot more slowly, because it takes a lot more convincing to get people that had definitively made up their mind about whether or not they like this president to come around. So you're right. Should in any normal political crisis, would a president enjoy a bigger bounce? Yes, but the president has ingrained people's opinions so deeply that I think it's just a heavier lift for him to move that. To me, what I'm watching, Dan, is not where we are today, but I'm seeing that there is movement, and that presents the opportunity for President Trump. One thing in politics that can be the most frustrating is when you don't have control. And I look at a Joe Biden, and it's got to be very difficult because you don't have a lot of control. Really, what President Trump does or doesn't do with COVID and how that ends up is likely to be the destiny of Joe Biden. In this case, yes, there are larger factors. Of course, the federal government doesn't control everything related to coronavirus, but this is something where the president, if he can continue to show progress and the nation approves of that, I suspect his approval numbers will continue to trickle up. But again, he's got a runway, not a long runway on this one, but he does have a runway.
Well, let's agree that almost every election is a referendum on the incumbent, and that this election in particular was always destined to be an up or down referendum on Donald Trump, and that if anything, the current environment raises the stakes and makes it a referendum not just on Donald Trump generally, but more specifically on how he handles this crisis going forward. So let's do this. We're going to go to your questions in just a minute. And just as a reminder to all of you that Jessica will send me as many of your questions as possible. But I want to switch from politics to logistics, if I can, John. We talked earlier about how most of the remaining primary states have delayed their primaries until May or to mid-late June. In order to hopefully have something that approximates a more normal election day. My home state of Wisconsin is going forward with its primary on Tuesday without having a good sense, none of us do, about what the virus is going to have done to us by November. Is voting by mail either predominantly or exclusively what we're looking at for this election?
Yeah, I mean, we've been seeing this trend, though, moving in that direction for some time now, using vote by mail. California, in certain counties like Orange and others, are mail everybody a ballot. Yes, we're going to see, instead of one big election day, we're going to see, an ongoing election month or whenever the ballots get mailed out. So that does change a little bit how we campaign. It just means that the TV campaigns have to start earlier. You have to make sure that You do things like in California, you can do ballot harvesting, get out the vote activities. That's all changed a little bit because it was, for instance, Dan, it was hard to get people to open up their door to strangers anyway, knocking up to canvas. Imagine now, who wants to open up their door? Even if I know who's knocking on my door, they're wearing a Joe Biden t-shirt, I know just by virtue of what they're doing that they've probably knocked on 200 other doors today. They've literally are potentially virus spreaders. So it's just going to make it that much more difficult. But the good news is this: we know how to handle vote by mail campaigns. This is not particularly new. It just means we have to put a bigger emphasis on it than before.
And as I mentioned, I believe to this group last week, California has been a forerunner in this field. In 1990, I think 16 or 18% of Californians voted by mail. In 2018, almost 70% did. So as John is absolutely correct that this is an ongoing trend on which our state has been one of the states that have acted as forerunners for the rest of the country. But John, I want to ask you one more question before we go to our attendees' questions. You were talking about the added challenge of door-to-door campaigning. And not only personally would I not want to open the door to a canvasser, anybody I know and care about, I would very strongly discourage them from engaging that kind of activity, no matter how strongly they felt about a candidate or a cause. To what degree can online campaigning, emailing, texting, Zoom, to what extent can digital communications take the place of that more traditional face-to-face canvassing activity?
Well, it's going to have to take almost entirely the place. The good news is we've been using tools, digital tools, in lieu of face-to-face campaigning, or not, maybe not in lieu, but as a supplement. Things like texting apps, and much of this has been done remotely using these digital efforts because if you're in a large enough jurisdiction, your volunteer can't drive to the campaign office after work in time. So we were able to, we have people that will call into a Texas governor's race based out here in California that'll do phone banking from here. So all of that tech has been used for some time. We're just going to have to rely upon it more. But we're going to have to go even deeper. And there's some new tricks we're using. For instance, there's an app, it's called Rumble Up. And what you can do is if your volunteer installs the app on his or her phone, it will literally go through your contact book, if you allow it, to look for any friends with area codes that are in that jurisdiction of that election, and immediately text out a mass message on, customized from you to your friend, not just telling them about a candidate, but getting them to sign up, getting them to engage, those kind of things. You're going to see a lot of video conferencing sessions, trying desperately to get, at least, especially if it's a down ballot race, trying to get voters and supporters to hop on a quick Zoom call. You're going to see all those things happening in bigger ways than we've ever seen.
Great. I have about 1,000 more questions for John, but Jessica tells me that we've got quite a few that are coming in from our participants. So Jessica, why don't we open this up and go to as many of their questions as we're able to fit in for our second 30 minutes.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to try to combine some of these questions because we're getting some that are very similar. But we'll start with, what should the media role be in managing the truthfulness of ads on TV and social media?
Well, it's a great question, John, and it's one that goes, as the questioner noted, it's not just a question for digital media, but for TV ads also. If I run an ad that says something demonstrably false against John Thomas, number one, should that ad be able to run? And number two, what's your recourse?
Yeah, this is not new, whether it's on digital or traditional means of communication. Well, first of all, we do have libel and slander laws in place, although they're difficult to enforce when you're a public figure. But if you are out and out lying, I mean, just if you're saying, I murdered somebody when in fact I didn't, my legal team can get that ad pulled down immediately from television. So that's a tactic. But generally speaking, smart campaigns would never do that because they know that the ads would not live. They will nuance it around the corner. I'll use a good example of a LA mayor's race that perhaps cost Wendy Gruhl her election. Her election team went up with their very first beautifully produced television ad saying she saved as controller the people of Los Angeles. I want to say it was like $150 million was the claim. One problem was the LA Times fact checked that she did. I think she saved them 18 million or 20 million, not 150 million. Not only did the ad get taken down, but she was called by the LA Times and others basically a liar, which gave her opponent, Eric Garcetti and others, an opportunity to hurt the credibility of Wendy's campaign, and she just essentially never recovered. So I always say that it's up to both the press, but as well as rival campaigns to fact check, and we sometimes utilize those lies as a way to actually turn the tables on our opponents. So it's up to rival campaigns to hold each other accountable. Where this becomes more problematic, Dan, is not in the high-profile races, because there are the LA Times and the New York Times and an army of bloggers and candidates running against each other with lots of money to call out the lies. Where this is most damning is in the down-ticket baby races, races for school board, races for city council, where somebody does send out some mailers that are demonstrably false, and there's no press corps to call it out, and there's no opponent with real resources to correct the record. That is the deepest challenge.
Yeah. And if I can just add, Jessica, because John made several really good points, but to get to the core of the audience member's question, the legal standard for taking those ads off the air is very, very high. But to offer just a little bit of historical perspective, the role of the media that John talked about is a particularly important one. Back in the late 1980s, the newspaper The Charlotte Observer in North Carolina pioneered what they called truth boxes, where in addition to their regular coverage of a campaign for president or for governor or for senate, they would run a boxed feature in which they ran the text of a candidate's ad and then analyzed whether it was true or false. And what became David Broder, the late great Washington Post columnist, spread this idea around the country. And by the 1990s, most major newspapers throughout the country were running these truth boxes. So there is a role for the media in calling out either these lies or even very exaggerated or misleading claims. But the second point that John made is a really important one also. The real value of these truth boxes, we learned, is that it provided an opportunity for the opposing campaign to put an ad on of its own, saying the Los Angeles Times says that Smith's ad is incorrect. The Charlotte Observer says that Jones's ad is wildly exaggerated. So just like you see movie reviews showing up in ads, ultimately the news media's role, followed by the opposition's role, tends to be a much more significant control on the type of thing that our audience members asking about than a legal threshold.
Thank you. We have several questions about Governor Cuomo. You mentioned Governor Cuomo as being a much more visible leader than Joe Biden. Any chance he might jump in before or at the convention to become the Democrat nominee, or perhaps become Biden's running mate? Are there any polls on Governor Cuomo's favorability?
Well, John, I've seen polls of Governor Cuomo's favorability in New York, which have skyrocketed. His favorability ratings have gone up 50, 60 points over the last few weeks. Now, Cuomo himself has said publicly that he has no intention of running for president, at least not in 2020. But this gets back to the point that you were making earlier, the inherent political advantage of an office holder who has real world responsibility for the lives of his or her constituents versus even an experienced public service servant like Joe Biden, who doesn't have an official role to play in this discussion.
Yeah, when Governor Cuomo being interviewed by his brother Chris on CNN definitively ruled out running for president, I didn't believe that for half a second. So just because a politician says no today doesn't mean it's not a no tomorrow. So I think it's all the worst thing Governor Cuomo could possibly say is that he's interested in running for president in 2020 right now. I mean, it would taint every single word that he says in his official capacity through a political lens that would hurt his chances, not just to be effective at this crisis, but also if he did want to wedge in. I'm not convinced that Joe Biden will be the nominee. I think he likely will, but we are in such a unusual circumstance, and Governor Cuomo is playing such a high profile foil or role in this in what's going on here. I wouldn't be surprised at all if the baton is handed to a Governor Cuomo. Now, here's the question about the vice president was interesting. Perhaps Biden could select Cuomo as VP, but that would then cause an identity issue because Joe Biden has promised that he would nominate a woman as his VP. So that opens up a whole another can of worms for Joe Biden if he made that switch.
I think the last point is a particularly instructive one. First of all, let's agree that making predictions of any type, medical or political or any other in this environment, is a particularly hazardous endeavor. So smart for you for shying off. But I think your point about Biden's running mate is a smart one. Andrew Cuomo has many qualifications, but Joe Biden did commit that he would pick a female to be his running mate, and that is not a qualification that Andrew Cuomo has. It is worth noting, though, that the vice president took a minute to highlight Governor Whitmer of Michigan as a potential running mate in the immediate aftermath of her very contentious back and forth with President Trump. This goes back to something we talked about earlier, that when the president decides to work in a present himself on a bipartisan basis, as he had with Governor Newsom, John's right, that does work to his benefit. A more confrontational approach with a Democratic governor of the key swing state of Michigan is a little bit higher risk behavior. Okay. Jessica?
Thank you. Yes. How will an increase in mail-in ballots impact election security?
It's a great question. On one hand, voting by mail, John, not only creates convenience as it has in the past, but also helps alleviate legitimate health and medical concerns. Have you seen evidence that as states, California and others, have moved to more frequent voting by mail, that it has increased potential ballot security concerns?
Well, I've let me segment this conversation in two different ways. One is we have not seen higher evidence of voter fraud, so there isn't that, but we have experienced a much higher concern of potential voter fraud, and both can be true at the same time. I mean, if you just think about it logistically, in Orange County, California, when everybody receives a ballot, ballot harvesting is